On January 3, 1889, in the Piazza Carlo Alberto in Turin, Italy, Friedrich Nietzsche witnessed the public beating of a horse by its coachman. Nietzsche crossed the square, threw his arms around the animal's neck, and collapsed onto the pavement. When he regained consciousness, the fragments of lucidity that remained were enough only to compose a series of delirious letters, the so-called madness letters, addressed to Cosimo Wagner, Jacob Burckhardt, King Umberto I, and Prime Minister Marco Brin, signed alternately as Dionysus, or the Crucified One. The theologian, Franz Overbeck, travelled from Basel to personally retrieve him. Nietzsche was admitted to the psychiatric clinic of the University of Basel, and subsequently transferred to the private clinic of Dr. Otto Binswanger, in Jena. The recorded diagnosis, progressive paralysis. The silence that followed lasted 11 years, until his death on August 25, 1900. Before we trace the years that carried Friedrich Nietzsche from Prussian Saxony to that square in Turin, I invite you to become part of this channel. If this kind of narrative built on documented facts and told with the sobriety your night deserves is what you're looking for, subscribe now. By leaving a like, you sustain the continuity of this historical and philosophical archive for all those who seek deep understanding as a form of rest. Breathe slowly. The journey of Friedrich Nietzsche is about to begin. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in Röcken, in the Prussian Duchy of Saxony, and died on August 25, 1900, in Weimar, in the Grand Duchy of Thuringia. His active philosophical output was concentrated between 1869 and January 1889. A span of 18 years cut short by his definitive psychiatric collapse. The central argument of this account is the radical codependence between his medical biography and his philosophical output. Chronic migraines, progressive partial blindness, gastric pain diagnosed as dyspepsia, and recurring vomiting formed the physiological foundation upon which Nietzsche developed his principal philosophical categories. The technical diagnosis of European nihilism and the formulation of the death of God as a historical cultural event that stripped theological authority from Western civilization were elaborated under conditions of health that would make any systematic intellectual production clinically improbable. The popular image of Nietzsche as an isolated madman is technically inaccurate and intellectually useless. Nietzsche's philosophy was a direct physiological and methodological response to his own medical and social biography. His Lutheran clerical lineage from Prussian Saxony, his rigorous training in classical philology at Schulpforta, and his years as a professor in Basel are not decorative biographical context. They are the causal variables behind the virulence of his later moral critique. In the chapters that follow, each phase of his life will be documented with chronological precision and references to available primary sources, from his school notebooks to the clinical diagnoses at Jena. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the village of Röcken, in the Kreis-Lützen district of Prussian Saxony, approximately 12 miles southwest of Leipzig. The choice of birth date was not incidental to the family. October 15th was the birthday of King Frederick William IV of Prussia, and Nietzsche's father, the Lutheran pastor Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, recorded that coincidence with satisfaction in his diaries. The paternal family included 4 consecutive generations of Lutheran pastors, which lent the domestic environment of Röcken a rigid structure of theological authority and a deep familiarity with biblical texts and Protestant exegetical tradition, an influence that would leave a lasting mark on Nietzsche's intellectual formation. Karl Ludwig Nietzsche died on July 30, 1849, when Friedrich was 4 years and 9 months old. The diagnosis recorded by the attending physician was Gehirnerwitchung, brain softening, a 19th century term designating a cluster of degenerative conditions of the central nervous system, possibly including what today would be classified as vascular dementia or a brain tumor. Carl Ludwig had exhibited progressive symptoms of loss of consciousness and convulsions for roughly a year before his death. In January 1850, Friedrich's younger brother, Joseph, died at the age of 2. The sequential deaths of his father and infant brother transferred the family's structure to his mother, Franziska Ola Nietzsche, who relocated with Friedrich and his sister Elizabeth to Naumburg an der Saale, where the paternal grandmother resided. In Naumburg, Nietzsche attended the municipal school and demonstrated an early aptitude for musical composition and Latin. In 1858, at the age of 13, he was admitted to the Schulpforta, known as Schulpforta, in Schulpfurt, near Naumburg. Schulpforta was one of the 3 elite secondary institutions in Prussia, founded in 1543 by Prince-Elector Maurice of Saxony. The curriculum was rigorous: Latin and classical Greek at a university level, Hebrew, mathematics, history, natural sciences, and music. Students lived on campus under a near-monastic discipline, with fixed schedules for individual and collective study, communal meals, and strict restrictions on leaving the grounds. At Schulpforta, Nietzsche consolidated his technical command of Latin and ancient Greek, producing translations and commentaries on authors such as Pindar, Theocritus, and Sophocles. In 1864, his graduation thesis was a philological analysis of Theognis of Megara, a 6th century BC Greek elegiac poet, examining the authenticity of the poetry collections attributed to him. It was during his years at Schulpforta that Nietzsche experienced the first documented episodes of severe migraines. Available sources, including letters to his mother and sister and the school's infirmary records, indicate recurring episodes of intense headaches accompanied by visual disturbances, nausea, and vomiting. The school's physicians attributed the migraines to excessive eye strain. During long hours of reading under poor lighting, Nietzsche developed severe myopia, which stayed with him for the rest of his life and progressively worsened, leaving him dependent on thick-lensed glasses and limiting his hours of reading and writing. Nietzsche's formation at Schulpforta holds direct relevance to his later philosophical output because it established his fundamental intellectual method: the genealogical analysis of texts, the search for historical layers of meaning, and the systematic distrust of interpretations consolidated by tradition. The very method Nietzsche would apply decades later to dissect Christian morality in On the Genealogy of Morality was, in its technical form, developed in the Greek philology classes at Schulpforta. His familiarity with Lutheran theological thought, acquired in the family environment of Röcken and in the school's theology courses, provided the specific material against which that method would eventually be turned. Nietzsche completed his studies at Schulpforta in September 1864 and enrolled at the University of Bonn to study theology and classical philology, in keeping with family expectations and the clerical tradition of his paternal lineage. His abandonment of theology 1 semester later was not an impulsive act but the result of an intellectual reorientation already underway. During his final years at Schulpforta, where reading authors such as Friedrich Hölderlin and Byron had introduced perspectives incompatible with the Lutheran orthodoxy of Röcken. At the University of Bonn, in the winter semester of 1864 to 1865, Nietzsche enrolled in theology and classical philology, following the expected path for a pastor's son with his background. The professor of classical philology at Bonn was Otto Jahn, a leading authority in classical archaeology and ancient music theory. Nietzsche attended Jahn's lectures and made his first contact with the professor Friedrich Nietzsche, a specialist in Latin philology and editor of the journal Rheinisches Museum, Fr. Philology. The relationship with Ritschl would be decisive for Nietzsche's subsequent academic career. In April 1865, Nietzsche informed his mother Franziska by letter that he would not continue his studies in theology. The decision marked a formal break with his family's clerical expectations and with the Lutheran tradition of Röcken. Franziska and Elizabeth met this with resistance, but Nietzsche held firm. In October 1865, he followed Friedrich Ritschl when the latter transferred to the University of Leipzig, where he enrolled exclusively in classical philology. In Leipzig, Nietzsche co-founded the Philologische Gesellschaft, the Leipzig Philological Society, with fellow students, dedicated to reading and discussing classical texts and presenting ongoing research. In the autumn of 1865, at a second-hand bookshop in Leipzig, Nietzsche came across a copy of Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, originally published in 1818. In Letters and later autobiographical fragments, Nietzsche described the impact of reading Schopenhauer as immediate and formative. Schopenhauer's central thesis that the underlying reality of the phenomenal world is a blind, irrational, and perpetually unsatisfied will, provided Nietzsche with a philosophical system that legitimized atheism and pessimism as rationally grounded positions, standing in sharp contrast to the providential optimism of the Lutheran theology in which he had been raised. Schopenhauer's influence on Nietzsche operated on two distinct levels. On the theoretical level, the Schopenhauerian conception of the will as a primordial force would be reworked by Nietzsche decades later into the concept of will zur, matched the will to power with a fundamental inversion, where Schopenhauer prescribed the denial of the will as a path to redemption from suffering. Nietzsche would propose its radical affirmation. On the methodological level, reading Schopenhauer introduced Nietzsche to the tradition of German philosophical pessimism and supplied the conceptual tools for his critique of Socratic rationalist optimism, which would be central to the birth of tragedy. In 1867, Nietzsche presented to the Leipzig Philological Society two research papers, one on the sources of Diogenes Laertius and another on the composition of the Theognedean collections, papers that Ritschl judged sufficiently original to merit publication in the Rheinisches Museum. Publishing academic research before completing a doctorate was unusual, and it placed Nietzsche in an exceptional position within German philology, where the conventional path required years of preparation before any publication. In October 1867, before finishing his doctorate, Nietzsche was drafted for mandatory military service and assigned to the 4th Mounted Artillery Regiment in Naumburg. During a cavalry exercise in March 1868, he suffered a serious injury to his left pectoral muscle while attempting to mount a horse in an abrupt motion. The injury was severe enough to keep him hospitalized for several months and resulted in his discharge from military service in October 1868. With a certificate of permanent unfitness for strenuous military activity. The episode was the first in a series of physical setbacks that would systematically limit his mobility and productivity throughout the following decades. While recovering from his injury in Naumburg, Nietzsche continued working on his philological studies and returned to Leipzig to complete his degree. In November 1868, Nietzsche was introduced to Richard Wagner at the home of physician Hermann Brockhaus, Wagner's brother-in-law, in Leipzig. Their first meeting lasted several hours. Nietzsche and Wagner discussed Schopenhauer pre-Socratic Greek philosophy and the project of German cultural renewal that Wagner was developing in his theoretical essays. For Nietzsche, who was 24 years old, the encounter with Wagner represented his first contact with an intellectual figure capable of combining large-scale philosophical ambitions with an artistic body of work of concrete cultural impact. The relationship that would develop in the years ahead would be the most significant and, ultimately, the most destructive of his adult intellectual life. In February 1869, the University of Basel in Switzerland offered Friedrich Nietzsche the position of extraordinary professor of classical philology. Nietzsche was 24 years old and had not yet completed his doctorate. The appointment was made possible by an unreserved letter of recommendation from Friedrich Nietzsche, who declared Nietzsche the most gifted student in 40 years of teaching. The University of Leipzig granted him an honorary doctorate in March 1869, based on his publications in the Rheinisches Museum. To take up his position in Basel, Nietzsche was required to renounce his Prussian citizenship, since Swiss law made it difficult to permanently hire foreigners in academic positions. He did not obtain Swiss citizenship at that time and remained stateless for nearly his entire adult life, a condition that reinforced his institutional isolation and that aligned with his increasingly anti-nationalist philosophical stance. Nietzsche began teaching in Basel in May 1869 and was appointed full professor with a tenured chair. In 1870, in July 1870, the French Empire and the Kingdom of Prussia went to war, the conflict that came to be known as the Franco-Prussian War. Nietzsche, despite having renounced his Prussian citizenship, petitioned the Basel authorities for permission to serve as a volunteer. Permission was granted on the condition that he serve as a medical orderly rather than a combatant, in order to preserve Swiss neutrality. Nietzsche served as a field orderly in wounded transport units during operations in Alsace between August and September 1870. During this service, he contracted dysentery and diphtheria simultaneously. The dysentery caused lasting damage to his digestive system, and the diphtheria left residual effects that contributed to the chronic gastric problems that would plague him for decades. Nietzsche was repatriated to Basel for treatment and did not return to the front. The period between his return to Basel in 1870 and the publication of The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music in January 1872 was one of intense theoretical work. Nietzsche developed the fundamental distinction between the Apollonian and Dionysian principles as organizing forces of ancient Greek culture. The Apollonian principle, named after the god Apollo, represented order, individuality, rationality, and protective illusion. The Dionysian principle, named after the god Dionysus, represented excess, the dissolution of the individual into the collective, instinct, and the acceptance of suffering as a constitutive element of existence. The book's central thesis was that classical Greek tragedy had reached its highest point of power by balancing these two forces, and that the intervention of Socrates had destroyed that equilibrium by introducing rationalism as the supreme criterion of value. The book included a final section identifying Richard Wagner as the contemporary heir to the Dionysian spirit, connecting the philological thesis to Wagner's project of German cultural renewal. This section, about which Nietzsche himself later expressed reservations, compromised the work's academic reception. The philologist, Ulrich von Wilhelmortz-Mollendorff, then 22 years old, and a former schoolmate of Nietzsche at Schulpforta, already recognized as one of the sharpest minds in German philology, published in 1872 a pamphlet titled Zukunftsphilologie, philology of the future, attacking the birth of tragedy on technical philological grounds, the absence of scholarly footnotes, imprecision in the citation of primary sources, and the subordination of historical analysis to a contemporary cultural agenda. Nietzsche's reply and Wilemowicz's counter-reply deepened the dispute, but the damage to Nietzsche's academic reputation within classical philology was permanent. Erwin Rohde, Nietzsche's close friend since Leipzig and one of the most respected philologists of the next generation, published a defense of the birth of tragedy titled Afterphilology, in which he attacked Wilemowicz with considerable methodological force. The public exchange between Rohde and Wilemowicz mapped out the fault lines between historically oriented philology and culturally oriented philology, a divide that would structure the field for decades to come. Nietzsche never returned to conventional academic philology after the birth of tragedy. Philology had been the instrument. Cultural philosophy would be the territory. His seminars in Basel emptied out, and the prospect of a conventional philological career was finished. The relationship between Friedrich Nietzsche and Richard Wagner was the primary intellectual and personal alliance of Nietzsche's adult life, until its definitive rupture in 1876. The contact begun in Leipzig in November 1868 developed rapidly after Nietzsche's arrival in Basel in 1869. Because the Villa Tribschen in Lucerne, where Wagner lived with Cosima von Bülow, daughter of Franz Liszt, was approximately 37 miles from Basel, Nietzsche paid his first visit to Tribschen in May 1869, 3 days after arriving in Switzerland, and would repeat the visit some 23 times between 1869 and 1872, when Wagner relocated to Bayreuth. Life at Tribschen was intellectually intense. Wagner and Nietzsche shared an admiration for Schopenhauer and a fascination with the pre-Socratics, especially Heraclitus. Wagner discussed with Nietzsche the philosophical foundations of his operas and the theoretical essays he was drafting, including opera and drama and the artwork of the future. Nietzsche, in turn, used the Wagnerian project as a framework for organizing his own theses on the relationship between art and culture in ancient Greece, which resulted in the birth of tragedy. The book's dedication to Wagner was not merely a gesture of personal acknowledgement, but a declaration of programmatic alliance. The tensions between the two, however, were structural and grew progressively more pronounced. Wagner was 29 years older than Nietzsche, an age gap that established a generational asymmetry that Nietzsche tolerated during the Tribschen years, but that became more apparent afterward. Wagner was explicitly a German nationalist and had, in 1850, published the essay Judaism in Music under a pseudonym, articulating a critique of Jewish influence in European music that Nietzsche regarded as intellectually dishonest and politically regressive. Nietzsche admired Goethe as the model of an Enlightenment European cosmopolitanism incompatible with Wagner's pan-Germanism, and he recorded that divergence in letters and notebooks throughout the 1870s. The Bayreuth Festival of August 1876 was the explicit breaking point. Nietzsche attended the rehearsals and opening performances of The Ring of the Nibelung at the newly inaugurated Festspielhaus, and left Bayreuth before the festival concluded. In his Bayreuth notes, preserved among his posthumous fragments, he recorded that what he had witnessed at Bayreuth was not the renewal of German culture he had anticipated in the birth of tragedy, but a mass entertainment event for the German bourgeoisie, driven by commercial logic and the desire to curry favor with Kaiser Wilhelm I, who had attended one of the performances. The staging of Parsifal, which Wagner was developing at the time, confirmed for Nietzsche that the composer had surrendered to the Christian morality that the ring of the Nibelung had seemed to promise surpassing. The break with Wagner was not a single event, but a documented process that unfolded across multiple stages between 1876 and 1882, when Nietzsche published The Case of Wagner and Nietzsche contra Wagner. On a personal level, Nietzsche never fully recovered from the dissolution of his relationship with Wagner and Cosima. His letters to friends from that period record growing isolation and the need to redefine his philosophical position entirely outside the Wagnerian framework, within which it had been shaped between 1869 and 1876. The rupture with Wagner also marked the beginning of a methodological reorientation. Between 1878 and 1880, Nietzsche published 3 works in a new analytical psychological style: Human, All Too Human in 2 volumes and Daybreak, Thoughts on the Prejudices of Morality. All 3 adopted the aphorism as their dominant form, a choice that was not merely stylistic but a physiological adaptation to the limitations imposed by his migraines. The phase following Bayreuth would be one of psychological analysis and genealogical deconstruction, applying against Wagner and Schopenhauer the same critical tools that Schulpforta had furnished for philology. The period between 1873 and 1879 was marked by a progressive and documented physiological deterioration that directly affected Nietzsche's ability to fulfill his academic obligations in Basel. The migraine episodes, present since his adolescence at Schulpforta, became more frequent and more severe. Nietzsche recorded in letters and notebooks episodes that confined him to darkened rooms for stretches of 2 to 3 consecutive days, unable to bear any source of light, unable to read or write, and accompanied by recurring vomiting. In particularly severe years, his migraine episodes added up to more than 150 days a year. Nietzsche's eyesight deteriorated significantly during the 1870s. An ophthalmological examination carried out in 1877 indicated that the retina of his right eye was seriously compromised, with a risk of total vision loss in that eye. His physician prescribed severe restrictions on eye use, making it virtually impossible to read and write in the quantities that academic work demanded. Nietzsche began dictating portions of his work to assistants or to his sister Elizabeth during periods when his eye problems flared up most acutely. In 1876, Nietzsche obtained medical leave from Basel and travelled to Sorrento, where he spent the winter of 1876 to 1877 with Paul Rée and Malwida von Meysenberg. It was during this period that his philosophical break with Schopenhauer and Wagner solidified. Human, All Too Human, published in May 1878, dismantled moral, aesthetic, and religious beliefs as historical constructions with no necessary metaphysical foundation. Wagner received a copy and correctly interpreted it as a declaration of rupture. In 1879, Nietzsche's health had become incompatible with maintaining his position in Basel. The rector and the university council, following medical consultation, offered Nietzsche early retirement with an annual pension of 3,000 Swiss francs, roughly 2/3 of his salary as a full professor. Nietzsche accepted. He was 34 years old. His formal academic career was over. His retirement opened what biographers refer to as his nomadic period. From 1879 to 1889, Nietzsche lived without a fixed residence, moving between locations that his physicians considered more favorable for reducing migraines and relieving his digestive problems. In summer, he stayed in Sils-Maria in the Engadin Valley in the Swiss canton of Graubünden, at an altitude of approximately 5,900 feet. In autumn and winter, he moved to the Italian or French Riviera, principally Genoa, Nice, and, in his final years, Turin. The choice of these locations was functional: altitude, mild temperatures, easily digestible food, and proximity to libraries or bookshops from which he could order books by mail. The nomadic existence carried direct social costs. Nietzsche maintained no stable social circle in any of the places where he temporarily stayed. His personal relationships were sustained primarily through correspondence, of which approximately 2,300 letters have been preserved. His most frequent correspondence included the musician and composer Peter Gast, who also served as copyist and typist of Nietzsche's manuscripts, Franz Overbeck in Basel, and his sister Elizabeth. During the periods he spent in Sils-Maria, Nietzsche developed the habit of daily walks of several hours along the trails around Lake Silvaplana, which he described in letters as his primary instrument for philosophical thinking. The altitude and isolation of the Engadin were deliberate conditions for philosophical work. Far from any university, far from any organized academic debate, far from the social life of the German and Swiss cities where he had grown up. The Sils-Maria journals record that Nietzsche would dictate passages of his texts to himself aloud during these walks. Using small notebooks as a support, the method responded directly to his visual limitations. Writing at a desk for extended periods was clinically inadvisable. Solitude was the permanent condition of Nietzsche's final productive decade, and he worked it out philosophically in the concept of pathos, of distance as the necessary condition for the clarity of philosophical diagnosis. The isolation of Nietzsche's 1880s was not only intellectual. In 1882, a single figure disrupted his settled solitude: the Russian philosopher and writer Lou von Salome, 21 years old, with exceptional intelligence on record and a radical independence that made that combination historically uncommon. The meeting in Rome was not a minor romantic episode in Nietzsche's biography. It was the only moment in which he sought to build an intellectual working community that included his own active presence. Lou's rejection and the destruction of the project by Elizabeth's interference pushed Nietzsche into the final creative solitude of Rapallo, from which thus spoke Zarathustra would emerge. In March 1882, Paul Rie, the German philosopher and writer with whom Nietzsche had lived in Sorrento in 1876 and who remained one of his closest correspondents, introduced him in Rome to Lou von Salome. Lou Andreas Salome, then 21 years old, was a native of St. Petersburg, the daughter of a Russian army general of French Huguenot descent, and a German mother. She had studied theology and philosophy at the University of Zurich, one of the few European institutions that admitted women to regular degree programs, and had developed interests in philosophy and psychology that made her an unusually qualified intellectual partner by the standards of the time. The meeting in Rome took place at St. Peter's Basilica. Nietzsche was immediately struck by Lou's intellectual capabilities and proposed to her. Within a few days, through R.E. as an intermediary, a tripartite intellectual working arrangement in which all three would live at the same address to facilitate daily philosophical exchange. The proposal was radically unconventional for 1882. Nietzsche also made a marriage proposal, also transmitted through R.E., which Lou declined clearly. Lou did accept, however, the idea of the intellectual partnership, and the three travelled together to Lucerne in May 1882, where the photograph that came to be associated with the episode was taken. Lou seated in a cart, holding a whip, with Rie and Nietzsche positioned before her as if pulling the vehicle. The photograph was conceived by Nietzsche and executed by the photographer Jules Bonnet. In the summer of 1882, the group spent time in Teutoburg in Thuringia, where Nietzsche had temporary lodgings. Lou described the Teutoburg meetings in letters to Ari as philosophically intensive conversations, but she also noted Nietzsche's emotional instability, his alternating between periods of euphoric productivity and episodes of severe depression. The situation was complicated by the intervention of Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who had discovered the group's plans. Elisabeth wrote letters to their mother, Franziska, and to Paul Rée himself, characterizing Lou as a woman of ill repute and denouncing the cohabitation proposal as morally unacceptable. Her letters referenced what she described as Lou's immoral behavior and cited Paul Rée's Jewish background as an aggravating circumstance. Elizabeth's intervention destroyed the project. Lou and Rée refused the proposal of permanent cohabitation and established themselves together in Berlin without Nietzsche. Nietzsche spent the autumn of 1882 in states of deep disturbance, recorded in letters to Peter Gast and Franz Overbeck, describing insomnia, suicidal thoughts, and an inability to work. In December 1882, Nietzsche traveled to Rapallo, on the Italian Ligurian coast, where the combination of his break with Lou, his conflict with Elizabeth, and his physical isolation produced a crisis that biographers describe as the lowest point of his adult life. It was in this condition that Nietzsche began writing Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The first part was drafted in Rapallo between January and February 1883, at a pace of production that Nietzsche described in letters as involuntary, as though the text were coming from outside himself. The speed of composition was exceptional. Roughly 250 pages of philosophical prose in 10 days of concentrated work. The figure of the prophet Zarathustra, who descends from his mountain isolation to announce the death of God and the imperative of the Übermensch, was directly shaped by Nietzsche's actual isolation and by the rupture with the last personal relationships he had attempted to maintain. The failure of the 1882 tripartite project had documented consequences not only for Nietzsche. Lou Salome developed her career as an independent writer and thinker in Berlin and Munich, publishing essays on philosophy, literature, and psychology in the intellectual circles of the German Fin des Kau. In 1911, she came into contact with Sigmund Freud after attending the Weimar Psychoanalytic Congress, initiating a professional and personal relationship that lasted for decades. In 1912, she became a practicing psychoanalyst in Göttingen, one of the first women to do so in Germany. Her 1894 study of Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche in Sinn und Wirken, analyzed the Nietzschean philosophical system as the expression of a personality in crisis, combining biographical perspective with conceptual analysis in a way that anticipated the psychobiographical method that would become current in the decades to follow. Paul Rée gradually withdrew from philosophy and died in 1901 under unclear circumstances, possibly by suicide, during a walk in the Swiss Alps. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was produced in 4 parts between January 1883 and January 1885, under conditions of health and isolation that made each phase of composition a demonstration of Nietzsche's capacity to operate. Philosophically, in spite of severe physiological limitations, the first part was drafted in Rapallo in February 1883. The second was completed in Sils-Maria in the summer of 1883. The third was written in the winter of 1883 to 1884, between Nice and Menton. The fourth part, originally conceived as a transition to a larger work that Nietzsche never completed, was drafted in Sils-Maria and Nice between the autumn of 1884 and the winter of 1885. The book used the historical figure of Zarathustra, the Iranian religious reformer of the 6th century BC and founder of Zoroastrianism, as its philosophical mouthpiece. The choice was deliberately paradoxical. Nietzsche selected the creator of one of history's first moralizing monotheistic religions to announce the overcoming of all religious morality. The style of the text combined biblical parables, philosophical aphorisms, and poetic prose in free verse, setting it radically apart from both the academic treatises of contemporary German philosophy and the analytical works that Nietzsche himself had produced in Human, All Too Human, and Daybreak. The three philosophical pillars of Zarathustra operated as an articulated system. The Übermensch, the Overman, was neither a racial category nor a description of a biologically superior human type, as the later Nazi reading would claim. It was a normative category describing the existential imperative for human beings after the death of God. In the absence of a theological foundation for values, the person who does not collapse into passive nihilism must become the creator of his own values. The Übermensch is the one who affirms that responsibility without recourse to transcendent foundations. The will to power, Will matched reworked Schopenhauer's will with a fundamental inversion. For Schopenhauer, the will was a blind and destructive metaphysical principle that ought to be denied as a condition for peace. For Nietzsche, the will to power was the fundamental driving force of all life and all creation, not a force that sought power over others, but a force that sought expansion, self-overcoming, and the increase of capacity. The denial of this force, for Nietzsche, was the central psychological mechanism behind Christian morality and the culture of resentment. The eternal return of the same Uwage, Wiederkomfort des Gleichen, was the most enigmatic of the three theses, and the one Nietzsche considered the heaviest to bear. The hypothesis, presented in Zarathustra, not as a rigorous philosophical argument, but as a thought experiment, proposed that each individual's life repeats itself eternally, in every detail, an infinite number of times. The philosophical value of the hypothesis was not cosmological but ethical. If you knew that every moment of your life would recur infinitely, would you be capable of affirming it without reservation? The capacity to say yes to that question, amor fati, the love of fate, was, for Nietzsche, the supreme criterion of philosophical vitality. The intellectual reception of Zarathustra among the handful of readers in the 1880s was divided between admiration and bewilderment. The composer Johannes Brahms acquired a copy and annotated it. Richard Strauss, in 1896, transformed fragments of Zarathustra into a symphonic poem, also Sprach, Zarathustra, OPP 30, introducing the text's central theses to an audience far broader than the printed editions had ever reached. Thus, Spoke Zarathustra was an immediate commercial failure. The first part, published in 1883 by the Ernst Schmeitzner publishing house, sold only 60 copies in its first year. Schmeitzner, who also published anti-Semitic literature, and whom Nietzsche despised for that reason, invested nothing in distribution or promotion. Subsequent parts circulated in diminutive print runs. The fourth part was self-published by Nietzsche in 1885 in an edition of 40 copies intended exclusively for a select group of friends. Critical reception was virtually non-existent during Nietzsche's lifetime. The broad recognition of Zarathustra as one of the foundational philosophical texts of the 19th century would come only in the 1890s, by which time Nietzsche had long since lost the capacity to witness it. The philosophical phase between 1886 and the collapse of January 1889 was the most methodologically coherent and the most systematically destructive of Nietzsche's entire output. Following the stylistic experiment of Zarathustra, he returned to dense analytical prose, now applying the methodology he called genealogy, the historical investigation of the conditions under which moral values arose, as opposed to traditional moral philosophy, which took values as given and sought to ground them rationally. Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886 by the Naumann Publishing House in Leipzig, articulated a critique of dogmatic philosophy from Plato onward as a series of variations on the theme of perspective denial. Nietzsche argued that all of Western philosophy had operated on the assumption that there existed a privileged, neutral, or absolute standpoint from which being and value could be described objectively. This assumption, for Nietzsche, was a form of intellectual dishonesty that served specific interests of cultural domination. The notion of the will, zur Wahrheit, the will to truth, as one of the most subtle forms of the will to power operating in disguise as objectivity, was developed in this book. In 1887, Nietzsche published On the Genealogy of Morality, composed of 3 articulated essays. The first examined the distinction between the opposing pairs good-bad, in the aristocratic sense, and good-evil, in the Christian moral sense. Nietzsche argued that the good-bad pair had arisen in ancient aristocratic cultures as a positive evaluation of strength, health, and life affirmation, with bad simply designating what was not good, namely weakness and negation. The good-evil pair, characteristic of Judeo-Christian morality, had arisen as an inversion engineered by the weak against the strong. What the powerful called good was reinterpreted as evil, and weakness, humility, and resignation were revalued as good. The second essay examined the genealogy of guilt and moral debt, arguing that the concepts of guilt, debt, and bad conscience had arisen from primitive economic relations between creditors and debtors, in which the debtor who could not pay in material goods paid with physical suffering. The internalization of that mechanism produced the guilty conscience as a psychological structure, one that Christianity had exploited to the fullest by introducing the idea of humanity's infinite debt to God. The third essay examined the ascetic ideal, the devaluation of bodily life and instinct in favor of spiritual life, arguing that the ascetic ideal had been the only response that European culture had found to the problem of suffering. The ascetic priest, for Nietzsche, was the psychological type who channeled suffering into guilt, transforming the aggressive instinct directed outward into aggression directed inward, which produced the domesticated human being of Christian morality. The Antichrist, drafted in Turin in the summer of 1888 and published posthumously in 1895, was the most concentrated application of these analytical tools. Nietzsche attacked Christianity not as a set of false theological doctrines but as a system of valuation that had systematically devalued what he considered the life-affirming forces: strength, health, nobility, creativity, and the affirmation of the present. The genealogical methodology of Nietzsche exerted direct technical influence on the 20th century. Foucault explicitly stated in his 1971 essay, Nietzsche Genealogy, History, the derivation of his own method, the genealogy of discursive and power practices, from the Nietzschean genealogy. Freud himself acknowledged, on several occasions, Nietzsche's anticipation of central categories of his psychology. The text is the most aggressive, both stylistically and argumentatively, of Nietzsche's entire output, and ends with a decree against Christianity signed with the fictitious date of September 30th, 1888, declaring war on the Church as a historical institution. It was drafted in the same months during which the symptoms preceding the collapse of January 1889 were becoming progressively more pronounced in Nietzsche's letters and notebooks. Nietzsche arrived in Turin for the first time in April 1888 and described the city in letters to Peter Gast and Franz Overbeck as the most suitable environment he had found for intense philosophical work: moderate climate, easily digestible food, regular streets well suited for the walks he used as a stimulus for thought, and a population he described as unobtrusive. Turin in 1888 was the capital of Piedmont and one of the best planned cities in Italy. With the great covered arcades of the historic centre that Nietzsche walked through regularly, he stayed at number 6, Via Carlo Alberto, in rooms rented by the month. The output of 1888 was the most intense of Nietzsche's entire career in both volume and pace. Between April and January 1889, he drafted or completed The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Nietzsche contra Wagner, and Ecce Homo, 5 works in 9 months, all produced under conditions of health that his letters describe as oscillating between episodes of exceptional clarity and periods of profound exhaustion. Ecce Homo, the intellectual autobiography Nietzsche drafted between October and November 1888, is the text most frequently cited by biographers and clinicians to trace the progression of the symptoms that preceded his collapse. The book is structured in biographical and philosophical chapters whose titles include Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books, and Why I Am a Destiny. The content of these chapters combines lucid and precise philosophical analysis with grandiose assertions that exceed any reasonable rhetorical convention. Nietzsche described himself as the only philosopher who had understood the crisis of European modernity, and the only one capable of diagnosing it with technical precision. He claimed that his work would divide the history of humanity into 2 periods, before and after Nietzsche. Psychiatrists who have retroactively examined these texts identify in Ecce Homo characteristics consistent with a severe manic episode or with the early stages of a progressive dementia syndrome. The retrospective diagnosis of Nietzsche remains controversial in the specialist literature. Diagnostic hypotheses include progressive general paralysis of syphilitic origin, the hypothesis of the psychiatrists in Basel and Jena in 1889, a brain tumor compatible with the symptoms of his father Carl Ludwig Cadasil, a hereditary cerebrovascular disease with compatible symptoms, and multiple comorbid conditions. No definitive consensus exists. In December 1888 and the first days of January 1889, Nietzsche's letters became progressively incoherent. A letter to August Strindberg dated December 31, 1888, ended with the question, "Am I going to hell?" Letters sent on January 3rd and 4th to Cosima Wagner, Jacob Burckhardt, King Umberto I, Prime Minister Marco Brin, and other recipients were signed as Dionysus, or the Crucified One, and contained assertions of divine identity and universal historical mission. On January 3, 1889, in the Piazza Carlo Alberto, near his lodgings at 6 Via Carlo Alberto, Nietzsche witnessed a coachman beating a horse. According to the account preserved by Giulio Turchi, a Turin lawyer who witnessed the scene, Nietzsche crossed the square toward the horse, threw his arms around the animal's neck, and collapsed. When bystanders helped him back to his apartment at Via Carlo Alberto, Nietzsche sat in silence on the sofa for several hours, and according to the account of the building's landlord, David Fino, sang and played the piano incoherently the following morning. Franz Overbeck arrived in Turin on January 8, 1889, alerted by the letters he had received. Jacob Burckhardt himself, upon receiving the letter signed as Dionysus, had immediately taken the document to Overbeck in Basel, recognizing that its contents indicated mental collapse. Burckhardt was a professor at the University of Basel, and had known Nietzsche since his early years of teaching. He refused any public speculation about Nietzsche's condition and maintained institutional silence on the episode until his death in 1897. Overbeck found Nietzsche huddled in a corner of the apartment in a state of prostration. Overbeck managed to transport him by train to Basel, where Nietzsche was admitted to the psychiatric clinic of the university under the care of Dr. Ludwig Will. In March 1889, he was transferred to the private clinic in Jena under the care of Dr. Otto Binswanger, where he remained until March 1890. The diagnosis, recorded in the files of both institutions, was progressive paralysis. Friedrich Nietzsche's internment at Dr. Otto Binswanger's clinic in Jena, from March 1889 to March 1890, was the period of greatest documented clinical instability. Binswanger's reports describe episodes of agitation, screaming, unmotivated weeping, and periods of complete mutism. Nietzsche did not consistently recognize visitors, including his mother Franziska, who traveled from Naumburg to Jena multiple times during the period. The reports record rare moments of partial lucidity in which Nietzsche would recognize family members or respond to simple questions, but these never lasted more than a few minutes. In March 1890, Franziska removed Nietzsche from the Jena clinic and took him to live with her in Naumburg, where she had rented a suitable apartment. Franziska maintained that decision against Binswanger's recommendation. Nietzsche lived with his mother in Naumburg from 1890 until Franziska's death in April 1897. During the Naumburg years, Nietzsche's condition stabilized into a state of profound dementia with partially preserved physical capacities. He walked in the garden, recognized Elizabeth when she visited, and responded to music, particularly piano. He produced no coherent verbal output and showed no consistent recognition of his own identity or his work. Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche returned to the European scene after a long absence. In 1885, Elizabeth had married Bernhard Foster, a Berlin anti-Semitic agitator, and the two had emigrated to Paraguay in 1887 to found the colony of Nueva Germania. The colony failed economically and Foster took his own life in June 1889. Elizabeth returned to Germany in 1893 and assumed control of Nietzsche's intellectual legacy. Taking advantage of the fact that he lacked the legal capacity to manage his own affairs, in 1894, Elizabeth founded the Nietzsche Cove in Naumburg, later relocated to Weimar in 1897, with the stated goal of preserving and publishing Nietzsche's manuscripts and correspondence. The archive obtained funding from German patrons interested in Nietzsche, and became a culturally significant institution in German intellectual life at the end of the 19th century. Elizabeth rigidly controlled access to the original manuscripts and directly managed which texts would be published, in what order, and with what editorial commentary. The extent of Elizabeth's editorial manipulation was documented in detail by philologists who examined the manuscripts after access was liberalized in the second half of the 20th century. Elizabeth compiled fragments from Nietzsche's notebooks of the 1880s, particularly preparatory materials he had discarded, and published them in 1901 under the title The Will to Power, presenting it as Nietzsche's central systematic work. That book did not exist as such in Nietzsche's manuscripts. He had abandoned the project of a work with that title in 1888. Elizabeth's compilation reorganized the fragments in ways that emphasized aspects compatible with German nationalism and omitted or softened passages in which Nietzsche explicitly attacked anti-Semitism and pan-German nationalism positions he had expressed with clarity in published works such as Beyond Good and Evil and in his letters. The impact of Elizabeth's editorial manipulations was especially severe in the context of Nietzsche's relationship to anti-Semitism. In multiple documented letters from the 1880s, Nietzsche had explicitly broken off correspondence with associates who adopted anti-Semitic positions, including Bernhard Faster himself. In a letter of March 1885 to Elizabeth, Nietzsche had written that he wanted no association whatsoever with anti-Semites, and that his sister and brother-in-law shamed him. This letter was suppressed by Elizabeth in the editions she controlled, and was only published in full after the work of Colli and Montanari. The suppression of this and other similar letters was the central editorial mechanism that made it possible for Nietzsche to be publicly associated with anti-Semitism for decades. Nietzsche was transferred to Weimar in 1897, following Franziska's death, where Elizabeth had established the Nietzsche Archive at the Villa Silberblick. He died on August 25, 1900, at noon, following a series of pneumonias in the preceding months that had accelerated the deterioration of his condition. He was 55 years old. Elizabeth organized the funeral and controlled the public statements regarding the meaning of his passing. The instrumentalization of his legacy, which had begun with the editorial manipulations of 1894, would continue for decades to come. The appropriation of Friedrich Nietzsche's thought by National Socialist ideology was a gradual process that benefited directly from the editorial manipulations of Elizabeth Faster Nietzsche and from the hermeneutic ambiguities that the disordered and selective publication of his manuscripts had introduced into the public reception of his work. Elizabeth, who outlived her brother by 35 years and died in 1935, worked systematically throughout the first 3 decades of the 20th century to position the Nietzsche Archive in Weimar as a cultural institution for legitimizing pan-Germanist and, later, Nazi ideology. The most visible point of contact between the Nietzscheanism propagated by the archive and nascent Nazi ideology was the publication of The Will to Power. The book compiled by Elizabeth, as noted in the previous chapter, was not a work by Nietzsche, but an editorial fabrication that selected fragments from the notebooks of 1880 to 1888 in a way that produced the appearance of a philosophical system oriented toward domination, hierarchy, and biological superiority. The concept of will zur matched, stripped of its context in the works Nietzsche himself had published, was reinterpreted by the ideologues of the NSDAP as the philosophical formulation of an imperative of racial dominance. Alfred Rosenberg, the NSDAP's chief racial theorist, cited fragments of Nietzsche in The Myth of the 20th Century, published in 1930, and considered the central doctrinal text of Nazism alongside Mein Kampf. Rosenberg used isolated passages about hierarchy among human types to legitimize the theory of Aryan racial superiority, systematically ignoring the texts in which Nietzsche attacked racism as a form of intellectual nihilism and those in which he explicitly praised European cultural intermingling. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche had written that the question of race filled him with nausea. Adolf Hitler visited the Nietzsche Archive in Weimar on at least 3 documented occasions, in 1934, 1935, and 1938. The photographs from the 1935 visit, in which Hitler posed alongside a bust of Nietzsche and next to Elizabeth, then 90 years old, were widely published by Reich propaganda. Elizabeth died in November 1935. And Hitler attended her funeral in person. The archive received funding from the Nazi government and was elevated to the status of a Reich cultural institution. The concept of the Übermensch was reinterpreted by Nazi propagandists as the description of a racially and biologically superior human type, the pure Aryan, in direct contrast to Nietzsche's original formulation, which was anti-racial and anti-biological. The Übermensch in Zarathustra was defined not by physical characteristics or lineage, but by the capacity to create values, to overcome nihilism, and to affirm existence without recourse to transcendent foundations. The distance between the original formulation and the Nazi reinterpretation was maximal, and any reader with access to the works published by Nietzsche himself could verify it. Elizabeth's editorial manipulation had created, with the will to power, a text that made the racist reinterpretation superficially plausible by severing the fragments from their argumentative context. The complexity of the relationship between Nazism and Nietzsche is underscored by the fact that Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, had reservations about the systematic use of Nietzsche in Nazi propaganda, considering the original work too individualistic and too critical of the state to adequately serve the movement's collectivist goals. The instrumentalization of Nietzsche by the NSDAP required the active suppression of texts in which he attacked the state, militarism, and nationalism as forms of mass nihilism. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche had written that the state was the coldest of all cold monsters, a passage absent from the anthologies produced by the Weimar Archive during the regime. The acceptance of the Nazi version of Nietzsche was not limited to Germany. In England and the United States, throughout the 1930s, Nietzsche's name was frequently associated, in mainstream publications, with Nazism and German imperialism. That association gravely damaged the academic reception of his work in the English-speaking world during the 1930s and 1940s, and made it necessary, after 1945, to undertake a complete and methodically rigorous review of the available texts to distinguish what Nietzsche had actually written, what Elizabeth had manipulated, and what Nazi ideologues had fabricated entirely on their own. The process of ideological decontamination of Friedrich Nietzsche's work after 1945 was complex, lengthy, and dependent on contributions from specialists across multiple countries. The problem was not only the association with Nazism, which had compromised academic receptivity. It was also the absence of a reliable critical edition of the complete works that would allow scholars to separate the texts published by Nietzsche himself from the fragments manipulated by Elizabeth and from the apocryphal texts that circulated under his name. The philosopher Walter Kaufmann, born in Freiburg im Breisgau in 1921 and emigrated to the United States in 1939, was the primary figure responsible for Nietzsche's academic rehabilitation in the English-speaking world. His book, Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist, published by Princeton University Press in 1950, was the first systematic study in English to methodically distinguish between the works published by Nietzsche, the posthumous fragments, and Elizabeth's editorial manipulations. Kaufmann demonstrated, through detailed textual analysis, that the identification of the Übermensch with any racial category was incompatible with the original texts, that the will to power was not a work by Nietzsche, but an editorial compilation, and that Nietzsche's texts contained explicit and recurring critiques of anti-Semitism and German nationalism. Kaufmann also produced the first widely circulated English translations of Beyond Good and Evil, on the genealogy of morality, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and other central texts. With scholarly apparatus that that contextualized the passages most frequently cited out of context by Nazi propaganda. Kaufmann's editions became the standard reference in the English-speaking world for several decades and contributed to the reception of Nietzsche's philosophy by American existentialism and cultural criticism of the 1950s and 1960s. In France, the post-war reception of Nietzsche was mediated first by existentialism and later by post-structuralism. Jean-Paul Sartre drew on Nietzschean concepts, particularly the idea of value creation in a world without transcendent foundation, as part of the framework of atheistic existentialism laid out in Being and Nothingness in 1943 and in the lecture Existentialism is a Humanism in 1945. Albert Camus examined nihilism and the response to the absurd in The Myth of Sisyphus in 1942 and in The Rebel in 1951, engaging extensively with Nietzsche's diagnosis of the death of God. Michel Foucault, in the 1960s and 1970s, explicitly acknowledged his methodological debt to Nietzsche's genealogy of morality, particularly in Discipline and Punish in 1975 and in the volumes of The History of Sexuality. The most decisive event for restoring the textual integrity of Nietzsche's work was the publication of the Kritische Gesamtausgabe, the complete critical edition of his works, directed by the Italian philologists Giorgio Colli and Mazzino Montanari, and published by the Walter de Gruyter Press, starting in 1967. Colli and Montanari carried out more than a decade of archival work, examining the original manuscripts at the Nietzsche-Hof in Weimar, which had passed into the control of the East German government after 1945, and systematically comparing them with the editions published by Elizabeth, and with primary sources available in other European archives. The findings of Colli and Montanari's research documented in detail the full extent of Elizabeth's editorial manipulations, altered texts, letters with passages suppressed, fragments reordered to produce meanings not present in the original manuscripts, and the fabrication of the will to power as an autonomous work from materials that Nietzsche had deliberately abandoned. The critical edition established, for the first time, a precise chronology of the posthumous fragments and made it possible to identify which passages belonged to which specific projects and at what stage of development they stood. Also contributing to the post-war reception were the works of Karl Jaspers, whose Nietzsche, An Introduction to the Understanding of His Philosophical Activity, published in 1936, had attempted a serious philosophical reading even during the Nazi period, and the lecture courses delivered by Martin Heidegger in Freiburg between 1936 and 1946, which established Nietzsche as a central problem for 20th century continental philosophy. The Montanari edition became the foundation for all serious academic research on Nietzsche in the decades that followed. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, hijacked by Nazi propaganda for decades, was restored to the history of European thought with the precision that his own methodology demanded. Nietzsche's diagnosis of European nihilism as an irreversible historical event shaped 20th century philosophy in direct and measurable ways. The existentialism of Sartre and Camus, the post-structuralism of Foucault and Derrida, the depth psychology of Freud and Jung, and the critical theory of the Frankfurt School all operate on the conceptual ground that Nietzsche prepared. The personal cost was documented with clinical precision. Migraines that accounted for months of incapacity each year, progressive blindness, absolute social isolation, and the final loss of reason at the age of 44. The posthumous corruption of his legacy by Elizabeth added to that cost a historical distortion that took decades to correct. Friedrich Nietzsche paid the highest price. The collapse of January 3, 1889. in the Piazza Carlo Alberto was not the end point of a philosophical trajectory, but the point at which the trajectory became inaccessible to its own author. Nietzsche had diagnosed with technical precision the crisis of foundations in modern European civilization, and had proposed responses that 20th century culture would take decades to begin processing. The question that persists in the works he left behind is not about his madness. It is about what it means to go on inhabiting a world whose foundations have been removed, and that question remains without a definitive answer in the historical and philosophical record available to us. If this factual account of Friedrich Nietzsche's life proved useful to your night, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your presence sustains the continuity of this historical and philosophical archive. Good night.